can see that.
Yes, right. This is just, the last year or so. Welcome to Behind the Pages. Justin Martin is with us today. Justin is the author of 4 books. He also has written articles for the New York Times and for the San Francisco Chronicle. He's here today to talk about Rebel Souls. This is a look at the birth of Bohemia in New York City in the 1850s and how this movement affected the work of poet Walt Whitman and basically his ultimate success. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you. Nice to be here.
Let's talk first about FAFS because that's very central to the book and to the Bohemian life in New York City in the 1850s. How did a saloon come to become such an important part of a movement that affected a poet's work?
Well, the reason for that was a man named Henry Clapp, who was a lapsed temperance lecturer from New England. He went over to France during the height of the first French Bohemia in the 1840s. And he was exposed to sort of the left bank, the flowering left bank cafe scene. And when he returned to New York City, he wanted to find a place to create a similar venue that would be the right place to sort of create an American Bohemia. And so this saloon called FAFS, which was at Broadway and Bleecker Street in New York City, it just struck him as being the perfect, both its location, Broadway and Bleecker Street, which was then is now kind of villagey. It was kind of the right area for the right types of people that lived around there, artists and so forth. And then also the specific saloon itself, which was owned by a German immigrant, had a kind of European libertine ambience that kind of reminded him of the cafes he'd been exposed to in Paris.
Would you just sort of define bohemianism and what that really is and what that means for artists?
Sure. The reason that this particular group of people that's featured in my book, such as Henry Clapp, the lapsed temperance lecturer, and Walt Whitman, and so forth, are called Bohemians is because Henry Clapp had gone over to Paris, and this group of people, they called themselves Bohemians. So he literally imported the term and the lifestyle. And it was a very codified lifestyle. I mean, it had attributes everybody will recognize, sort of an aversion to conventionality, a passion for art above all things, more talk of art in the cafes than actual doing of art, so people sit around talking about their masterpiece but never quite get around to it.
Yeah.
Sexual openness. A lot of the first French Bohemians were saddled with substance abuse problems, and then one of the hallmarks of that original French Bohemia, at least, was early death. The cliche is from tuberculosis caused by the chilly, damp, garret conditions that people were living in. So this was a kind of a codified lifestyle that Henry Clapp was exposed to in Paris, and so he thought, I'll bring it back to New York City, and and found my own Bohemian circle that has all those attributes.
Many of the poems in Walt Whitman's masterpiece, Leaves of Grass, were inspired by his conversations with fellow artists at FAF's saloon and around Henry Clapp's table. Can you expand on this a little? How did those discussions affect his poetry? Because that was not, he had an earlier edition of Leaves of Grass.
Sure, there are 3 different sort of threads that traveled through this FAFS group of Bohemians that really show up in Whitman's landmark 3rd edition of Leaves of Grass, which you might call the FAFS edition from 1860. One thing was this group of Bohemians, like Bohemians always, had a kind of a vein of darkness traveling through their get-togethers. So it was merrymaking with a sort of an undercurrent of darkness. And so Whitman's poems that appear in that landmark 1860 edition are noticeably darker in theme than some of his earlier poetry. Also, FAFS was a real gathering place for all kinds of, libertine would be the 19th century term, and of course, this included a number of gay men hung out at FAFS. What's especially notable about the so-called FAFS, what I call the FAFS edition, is a lot of poems Whitman wrote that appear in that edition, which are about the theme of romantic love between men. So that was very much from his experience of hanging out at FAFS Saloon. One other theme was this was a group of people who'd sit on this table, and they were, at a long table inside the saloon, and they were very influenced, sometimes directly, sometimes almost subliminally, by the dissolution of America and on the eve of the Civil War, the way the Union was falling into disunion was just, it was almost like it seeped into the saloon, the chaos, and flowed through the various artists. Many of the poems in Whitman's landmark 1860 edition dealt with this very theme of disunion, of the great American experiment shattering on the eve of the Civil War.
As he lived a pretty quiet life prior to that, didn't he?
He did. Well, he was always a quiet person from the standpoint of being a man of very few words in the world. On paper, of course, a man of
many words.
of many words. And he was, he was always a person who was kind of a quiet person, kind of taking it all in. But he was always a sort of a rambler. He loved to wander up and down Broadway in New York City, and he was a big personality from the standpoint that he loved living in New York and being in Brooklyn and sort of absorbing a lot of experience. He was out and about, a kind of colorful figure out and about town. But he wasn't as I said, he was a quiet person as far as his demeanor.
And he lived with his mother, and just kind of worked on his poetry. But it sounds like he didn't have a lot of experience of life to write about prior to that.
That's true. Or certain kinds of experiences he hadn't had. He was a journalist by trade before he was unemployed and living with his mother at about the time he started hanging out at Fast Saloon. So he'd seen a lot of New York City, but one thing that he was certainly drawn to as a gay man and a poet was any kind of sort of artistic scene, and this Bohemian scene was so appealing to him for those very reasons. And sitting at that long table in the saloon, surrounded by some really unusual. I guess what I would describe particularly that Whitman got out of being part of this circle is he was an unconventional person. He was an unconventional thinker. He was gay. This was a place where he was, not only was he accepted for being who he was, but he was surrounded by other people who were really sort of wild and untamed spirits. And I think he very much, this was something that was fresh for him. I think that accounts for why he spent a lot of time. In fact, he was at that saloon almost every night from 1858 to 1862. So that was what he was getting out of it.
We should talk a little bit too about Henry Clapp. Who was, as you mentioned in the beginning, the person who created this whole Bohemian life at this particular saloon. His early upbringing was almost the opposite of what you would think it would be for somebody who was so unconventional. Can you tell us about his life in New England?
Sure. He grew up in New England, part of a very strict Congregationalist family, and Congregationalism, of course, is just a descendant of being a Puritan.
Yeah.
So it gives people a flavor for the strictures of this lifestyle. And when at a young age, he discovered that he had a real ability as a lecturer. He was a very talented orator. In those days, you could make a living traveling around lecturing, particularly in New England, on various advocacy topics. So he lectured on abolitionism. He lectured on temperance and so forth. And he found that this was where he really had abilities. Then he went to Paris in 1849 for a 3-day World Peace Congress. And at that point, the Bohemian lifestyle was in full flower in Paris. He fell off the wagon. He'd been a temperance lecturer to that point. He fell off.
And he didn't drink at all.
That's right, didn't drink at all. Fell off the wagon, fell entirely into Parisian Bohemia, had intended to stay in Paris for 3 days, wound up staying for 3 years. And when he decided to return to America, he decided not to go back to New England, where he felt it had been, for him, a kind of, I think he felt it was a kind of stultifying environment. He decided to move to New York City and to bring this Bohemia that he'd so liked. So he was like so many people in the world or in history. He had a kind of a pendulum swing. He'd gone from being a very temperate person with this very rigid background to when he was exposed to, it's kind of like when people go away to college sometimes, the pendulum swung wildly the other way, and he returned to America ready to be an advocate for Bohemianism.
The Bohemian artists that met at FAST scattered for when when the Civil War rather commenced. Can you talk about this a little bit? Where did they all go, and specifically Walt Whitman. What did he do?
Sure. Well, you had a long table at Pfaff's Saloon that seated about 30 people, and you had a number of regulars. And besides Walt Whitman, and besides Henry Clapp, who sat at the head of the table, you had a guy named Artemus Ward, who was America's first stand-up comic. You had a guy named Fitzhugh Ludlow, who wrote a book called The Hashish Eater about his drug experiences, one of the best-selling books of 1857. He had a woman named Ada Isaacs Minkin, famous for her Naked Lady Act. And what happened was when the Civil War broke out, all of these artists had to kind of find their way. Very few of them, these were peaceniks, for lack of a better term. They wouldn't have called themselves that. That wasn't a term that existed then. But they were artists, they were sensitive souls. Very few of them actually signed up and went off to fight. That meant they had to find other ways to fit into this massive sort of dislocation, this massive crisis. Many of them fulfilled a role which exists to this day. They simply entertain the troops, the northern troops in this case, or they entertain the people on the home front who were full of anxiety and anxious for diversion. So many of them, such as Artemus Ward, America's first stand-up comic, a natural for him to tour around the Union states during the Civil War, entertaining the troops and entertaining people on the home front. Walt Whitman, who's always sort of a deeply ethical person, he wanted to find a role. He needed to find some way of being involved in this terrible crisis. Certainly, he couldn't have been a soldier. It wasn't his disposition.
Right.
He also didn't have the opportunity or necessarily feel like being an entertainer seemed too frivolous to him. He ultimately found just the ideal role for a person of his temperament. He went down to Washington, D.C., and he tended to the wounded soldiers in the hospitals in and around the Capitol. So that allowed him to be involved in this terrible crisis, but in a kind of on a humanitarian mission as opposed to helping people, which suited him, as opposed to shooting people.
Right.
Yeah.
This group at Pfaff's also had a connection to John Wilkes Booth. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. One of the many people who was part of this artist circle was Edwin Booth, and Edwin was part of an acting, you might call them an acting dynasty. Several of the brothers were actors. You had Edwin, Junius Jr., and then the one who history remembers, John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes was really Edwin, who was part of this circle at Pfaff's, was the far superior actor. John Wilkes was a very poor, sloppy, undisciplined actor. He was considered at the time much more handsome and in some ways more electric or charismatic than Edwin. But all those strings kind of come together. You've got a poor actor, a person who's very charismatic and very good looking. You also have in John Wilkes Booth a person who is just desperate for fame. In fact, one of the things that one of his childhood friends remembered him saying kind of ominously was, "Fame, fame, I must have fame." So acting was going to bring him some acclaim. He was matinee idol good looking. So he was going to find roles, but he had high aspirations, and he was also mentally ill. So you put those things all together, high aspirations, not a great actor, mentally ill, sort of a grandiose sense of his place in history, and the rest is history, of course. How he sealed his name in the history books.
Henry Clapp, again, I'm sort of talking about him, was, once he was in New York City and he set up his table, so to speak, at Pfaff's Saloon, didn't really make it that easy for people to become part of his table, did he? I mean, there was almost a passage, rite of passage that one had to go through to be able to sit at his table as a regular. He was
very ferocious. He founded a journal called the Saturday Press, and I always thought of him, what I learned about him, as being sort of an editor by temperament as well as by trade, and he edited his table. So he had 30 people on the table, and he thought about who is going to mix in well, who deserved to be a regular, who was, how was he going to create, sort of the perfect. It's almost like a chemistry experiment, or how some people run their dinner parties. Let's see who we can bring together, who really fits in. And he was always thinking about, who did he think was an incredible talent? He thought Walt Whitman was an amazing talent, recognized his genius before many other people did. So Walt Whitman was always going to find a place at that table. Someone like Artemus Ward, who I described earlier, America's first comedian, very sharp-witted, funny guy, certainly wanted him there. But if you showed up at that table as a newcomer, Henry Clapp, who was very fast on his feet, very sharp-witted, would throw out some comments to you, and he'd start a sort of a battle of wits, and some of the other Bohemians might join in as well. And if a person couldn't bear up under that, they'd beat a hasty retreat. Sometimes Clapp would sense that somebody, for whatever reason, he'd throw out some comments in French. And of course, he'd spent several years in Paris. He spoke French fluently. You answer Clapp in French, and you were really in trouble, because unless you could parry with him in fluent French and be witty in fluent French, that was going to send you packing. So it was a tough crowd that sat along that table. You know, they were in typical artist fashion. You know, they had delicate egos. They were sharp. You know, quick on their feet often, and so it was a kind of a ferocious little ecosystem that he set in motion.
How successful were the artists at the table?
A number of them were extremely successful for a brief period. I
mean, before or after, I think is what I mean. Like, did you almost disqualify if you were too successful? Would you not necessarily be accepted at the table?
That's a good question. I mean, there were certainly people who showed up who had some acclaim. They needed to be, I guess one way of putting it is they all fit into this Bohemian mold. So they had to be sort of countercultural figures. They had to be people that were controversial in their artwork. For instance, you had Ada Isaacs making the Naked Lady. You know, so you had people that were. So this was, of course, an earlier era in America. So being so controversial sort of limited your commercial upside. So there weren't too many people who came to the scene, and this very scene actually was it was kind of a transitional scene that started a tradition that's existed in American art since then of sort of the rebel artist. So I guess that's all to say. Most of these people came to the table relatively unsuccessful commercially, but they were big, bold personalities who were doing some kind of rebellious art. A lot of them, including Walt Whitman, of course, would ultimately become very successful figures for this very type of style of art they did, which the eve of the Civil War, a time when American society was in such tumult, was the perfect time for sort of provocative, snarky, to use a modern term, art.
Right. Yeah, because it seemed like, you know, I mean, Bohemia to me sort of suggests the starving artist, you know, and so if they weren't really starving, I mean, not literally, but I mean, in a sense, if they were too successful, it seems like they almost wouldn't really feel even themselves that they fit in there.
Very true. Well, they came, almost all of them, Whitman included, and you described earlier how he's living at home with his mother, unemployed. Almost all of them came to the table starving, but in a model that's, you know, an enduring model. Some of them, the very controversial, and Whitman has included this, of course, the very controversial and provocative nature of their art guaranteed that they would have some success. This particular group of Bohemians, in a sort of pattern that endures for a lot of Bohemians, though many of them, they got some early success or some success at a young age, and a lot of them, you know, due to their substance abuse problems and other things, weren't able to take it very far.
Right. I mean, women were allowed at the table, which was very unusual for that time period. Ada Clare, I think she was known as the Queen of Bohemia. How did she get her name? I mean, and who was she?
She was a Southern. She'd actually been raised a Southern belle by a Southern plantation family that went back to before the Revolutionary War, and it's funny. She ran off to New York. Ada Clare did. Her name was Ada McInerney. That was her given her birth name, and her family, which was this very estimable old plantation family, they'd raise money to build a statue of one of their distant relatives, who was John Calhoun, who was a big figure in the antebellum South. He was all for nullification, states' rights, and so forth.
Yeah.
They raised money for a statue. Ada Clare stole the money that was been raised for the statue, went off and set herself up in New York as an actor and essayist. As you can imagine, the family was horrified. She later paid the money back. She also changed her name to Ada Clare. And Ada Clare is a character in Dickens' book Bleak House, and Ada Clare is an orphan. So I took this as almost like a metaphor that she decided, you know, she'd been born into this very conservative plantation upbringing. She goes up to New York City, joins this Bohemian circle, becomes an essayist and actress, and so I think she thought of herself as kind of psychologically as an orphan. She'd left this world behind. She gave herself a new name, Ada Clare, and kind of recreated herself as a Bohemian.
Yeah, and one of the advantages to having this sort of bohemian life in that particular saloon is that the owner was European, which meant he didn't have as much problem with women, unescorted women, sitting with unescorted men.
Very true. And one of the things that really distinguished Pfaff, it's no coincidence that Henry Clapp chose it as his venue, as it was this European, had this European ambience, and that included gender at a time when there was real gender inequality or gender separation in the United States. You had at this long table a number of female regulars. And I should also mention that Henry Clapp, the man who set this whole thing in motion, one of the many topics he lectured on in New England before becoming the sort of the founder of the Feast for the Bohemians was women's suffrage. He actually lectured on this topic in the 1840s, 80 years before the 19th Amendment was passed.
Right.
And so he was very open to the idea of having women in this circle, and he was certainly it was his vision that caused there to be this mixed gender group of people sitting along this table as regulars.
Yeah, and it was impressive too because they weren't there hanging on the arm of men. They were there as equal members of the group.
Very much so. They were very. You had Ada Clare, who was sometimes called the Queen of Bohemia. She would take up position right at Henry Clapp's elbow, and she was extremely sharp-witted, and she was a very witty, funny person. Then you had Ada Isaacs Minkin, who was also known as the Naked Lady. She was probably one of the most colorful. I mean, you had an incredibly colorful group of people here, but she kind of was head and shoulders colorful above all of them.
Yeah,
so.
Because nobody even really, she invented so many biographies for herself, nobody really actually knows what the truth is.
Very, very true. No, she created so many, she kind of brazenly created so many contradictory stories about herself that ultimately you just had to sort of think, this fascinating person is just sort of a creation from her own mind, basically. But, and I should also mention, Walt Whitman. He was especially close, besides Henry Clapp, who really believed in him at a time when he was, sort of adrift as a poet. He really liked Ada Clare. He often made a point of sitting beside her, and he thought she was just a great wit. So this was this was an unusual circumstance where, as you said, it wasn't women their ticket of entry wasn't being on the arm of some well-known man. They were there on their own terms and for their own talent.
Walt Whitman, you mentioned in the book, didn't always sit at this big table. Sometimes he sat at a smaller table with his, how did he phrase his young boys? Or
his beautiful boys.
Beautiful boys, okay, yeah. Can you tell us about that?
Sure, well, I always like to describe it as there's a reason that Walt Whitman traveled 6 miles to go to a saloon, 6 miles round trip in the 1850s, and you're talking by foot, by coach, by ferry. That's a lot of work. He could have walked down the street and found a saloon.
Sure.
Pfaff's appealed to him incredibly because it was 2 different spaces he spent time there. There was the long table, where he'd be surrounded by his fellow artists, and they really kind of inspired him. And then half the time he spent at the long table, the other half of the time he spent further into the saloon, hanging out with various gay men. I mean, because this saloon was a sort of a place where if you didn't fit into 1850s society for any number of reasons, you might find your way to Pfaff's. And one of the many reasons was because you were gay. And so this was before there really were gay bars, when these things weren't so carefully or weren't so specifically codified. A generation before the term homosexual even came into existence. It was simply a place where men who were gay, they wouldn't necessarily call themselves that, but that was their orientation, were hanging out the saloon because they didn't fit into society.
Right.
Walt Whitman there too. And so, he spent. So basically, Pfaff's saloon was a place where it's a poet and a gay man. It was his saloon. It was the right environment for him.
I mean, I think you even said in the book you could call that, the first gay bar that existed, even though it wasn't exclusively so. But
very, very much. Yeah. So it was because it was a time of so much less definition in all things. It was just I always think of it as it was a bar for people that just didn't fit into society. That included gay people, but also a number of other types.
Yeah. Now, Walt Whitman had published 2 earlier editions of Leaves of Grass, and then, as you mentioned, the sort of the one that became famous happened after his time there. Had he not participated at the table at Faust and talked to people, do you think he ever would have achieved the kind of success that he did?
I don't, because there were a couple things that were very much at question. First of all was whether he was going to continue to write poetry. He was feeling very insecure about that. He hadn't had a lot of critical or commercial success, so he was questioning whether he should do something else. And he had a lot of, he'd been a working journalist, that was available to him. He'd done a lot of jobs that he could have moved into. So he was considering moving in a different direction. So you have the issue of this group of people really kind of bolstered him at a time when he was down. You also had the subject matter that Faust provided, the license it gave for him to explore darker themes and also to explore certainly themes of romantic love between men. What's another issue which is really critical here, it's conceivable that had he written another book of poetry, that he would have, had he not had the sort of the backing of the Faust set, he might have expurgated it. And the reason I say that is because after he wrote this landmark 3rd edition of Leaves of Grass, Ralph Waldo Emerson actually took a 2-hour walk with Whitman in which he suggested that he remove a lot of this bawdy and erotically charged poetry. Whitman was fresh from Faust, so Whitman refused to change anything. He left it exactly as it, refused to remove any of the dirty poems, as it were. Had he not had the backing of Henry Clapp and Faust, had he written another edition of Leaves of Grass and then spent 2 hours with Emerson, bearing down on him, he might have submitted. Had he submitted and had he expurgated the book, it wouldn't have had, as is the case then and now with art, an artwork which is controversial, an artwork which is visiting challenging and provocative new themes. That's something that can guarantee immortality ultimately. So if he'd done a more watered down, safe version, if he'd been under Emerson's sway more, maybe he would not be the poet that he is. Maybe he would not even be remembered.
And the Saturday Press, which you started to allude to earlier, that Henry Clapp founded and published, also exposed Walt Whitman. His poetry existed in that. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. The Saturday Press was a publication founded by Henry Clapp, and it was sort of almost like the mouthpiece for these Bohemians, and it was full of their work. It was also full of a lot of sort of gossip about their drunken revelry and their romantic connections and so forth. And for, this group of Bohemians had a kind of zeitgeist moment in the late 1850s, and it was driven by this publication, the Saturday Press, because you had people curious all over America about who this scene was, this group of scruffy, poorly behaved artists. And when an item would run in the Saturday Press, it would sometimes be reprinted as many as 200 publications around the country. So there's this kind of magnifier effect. And so Walt Whitman had a 3-year absence during which he hadn't had any poetry published. And so the first new poem that went out to the masses, as it were, was a poem Henry Clapp published, and it created a sensation. It went out all over the country, was seen by a lot of people. One of the people, or a group that saw it, was a publisher called Thayer and Eldridge in Boston. They then wrote to Walt Whitman and they said, we love this new poem that you published. Do you have any new poetry you're working on? Well, Whitman, his whole time at Faust, he'd written more than 100 new poems that hadn't seen the light of day yet. So he had this massive new poetry on those themes we described, romantic love between man and the fragmenting of the American Union. They were ready to go. So the fact that the Saturday Press broke Whitman to kind of renewed him. It opened up this opportunity when this Boston publisher contacted him. He had all these poems ready to go, and that was the sort of the landmark 3rd edition of Leaves of Grass. So the Saturday Press was essential for reviving Whitman.
Absolutely. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. It's really been a pleasure having you on the show, and your book is really fascinating, so
Thank
I
you.
appreciate your being here.
That's my pleasure.
You have been watching Behind the Pages from the staff of 22 City View. I'm Diane Goshgarian. Yeah, I mean, that half hour just went through so fast, I kept hearing, what? I only have 5 minutes left, you know.